Professor
Boa
Zavislak.
tarde.
Boa tarde.
Como é que estamos?
Passando frio, assim como você, mas tudo bem.
Boa tarde a todos.
Oi, Isabel, tudo bem?
Tudo bem, aqui também muito frio, não sei onde vocês estão.
Eu estou em Porto Alegre.
Ah, eu também, professor.
Ah, então.
Estamos na portinha.
Vou organizar aqui melhor. E tu está onde, Rafa?
Eu estou em Horizontina ainda, também aqui no interior. Só que aqui eu já descobri que a região noroeste do Rio Grande do Sul ela é menos fria do que Porto Alegre. Aqui eu passo menos
normalmente frio. O Alto Uruguai é sempre um pouco mais quente. Tem o Rio também, que passa ali perto, né?
Uhum. Paulo, tá tudo certo aqui, a apresentação já está aberta, assim que o professor Tice entrar. Tem bastante slide, né? Acho que...
Deixa ele apresenta primeiro e aí depois
Tá.
o que sobrar eu uso de tempo.
Tá bom. Bom, a dinâmica é de vocês, né? Claro.
Eu nem me apresentei, né, professora? Eu sou a Isabela, eu sou jornalista e mestre de cerimônias do evento. Então, antes de começar, eu só faço uma brevíssima introdução em inglês, apresentando vocês, e aí já passo a palavra para começarem.
Tá ótimo. Prazer, Isa.
Prazer.
E tu mora aqui em Porto Alegre, é isso?
Eu moro aqui, mas eu sou de 3 Passos. Aí o Rafael falou Horizontina, que é bem pertinho, né?
Sim.
Mas eu já moro aqui faz 11 anos agora.
Aproveitar aí, deixa eu fazer um teste do compartilhamento aqui do meu slide, pode ser?
Claro. Deixa eu dar uma olhada aqui. Eu vou te colocar como co-host, Paulo, para garantir. Eu sou o host da sessão, porque sou o monitor. Acho que agora não vai ter problema para compartilhar.
Deixa eu ver se está funcionando. Eu acho que está fora do esquadro aqui da minha... Não, tá certinho, né? Tá bem?
Tá tudo certo.
Bom, ok.
Okay, so 2 minutes, then we can start, right?
Hi, David.
Hello.
Hi, David. How are you?
Very good. I hope you got the slides I sent along.
Yeah. You see, well, I don't know where Rafael is appearing to you in the slide. Rafael, say hello. Rafael will drive your presentation.
Oh, very good. So I'll just say next slide. Okay,
Sure.
Rafael? Very good.
Perfect.
Do I have an hour? Is that right?
Huh?
How long do I have? 1 hour?
1 hour is the round table.
Oh, heavens. Oh, I misunderstood. So how long do I have then?
Well, you can take 20 to 30 minutes and I will take 10, no problem about that.
I'm just wondering, maybe we cut out section 1. I don't know if you looked at the slides and just go to section 2 because the focus is on universities as important pillars. So the first part, section 1, is about systems of innovation, and then I go to section 2. So why don't we start at section 2, because I don't want to take everybody else's time.
Sure, no problem. I can hide the slides on section 1 if you want, Professor Tees. And then the presentation starts on section 2. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Slide 19. Okay. And, we can distribute the slides afterwards and tell people that there's an introduction, which they may like. Okay, very good.
Do you want me to keep the outline slide, which is slide 2?
Yeah, why don't we put that up, and then I'll say that I'm skipping section 1 and going straight to section 2.
Okay, right? Perfect. All right.
Okay, so hello, everyone. Welcome again. I am Isabella Pesci, journalist and master of ceremony, and I invite you all to start another dialogue session. At this moment, we kindly ask that only the keynote speakers leave the camera on. Our dialogue session's title is Universities and Innovation Ecosystems, a Dynamic Capabilities Perspective. And we welcome Professor Dr. David Tees, Professor Dr. Paulo Zavislaki, and I guess Professor Dr. Moacir de Miranda Oliveira Jr. Welcome all, the floor is yours.
Very much. It's an honor being here with Professor Tees, Professor Zavislaki, all the guests, the audience. I'm sure this will be a very exciting, insightful panel. I will make a very short comment, and then I'll give the floor for the panelists. Just to bring a context, and the Triple Helix Conference is a traditional conference in the field of industry, government, and university relationships. And this year, the general theme is the sustainability, innovation for a sustainable world. And I'd like to ask our panelists to present themselves, but I want to make a short comment before. When I was doing my PhD, it was at the end of the past century, I spent 1 year as a visiting researcher at the Judge Business School at the University of Cambridge. And when I was there, I have the first contact with the seminal work of Professor David Tees. And it was the very, very, very famous article by Tees, Pisano, and Schwenn, the seminal article on in the field of dynamic capabilities. And I have to confess that I owe you this, Professor, because my PhD dissertation was about the knowledge management in global corporations and the putting together the idea of knowledge management and dynamic capabilities, make the bridge with the theoretical approach with the real world, and it helped me a lot. So thank you. And someday I will ask you to explain why that paper delayed so much to be accepted at the Strategic Management Journal. What called my attention at that paper, I think it was 1998, if I'm sure. I think it delayed about 7 years. But okay, if you can make a comment, okay, but no problem. If it's not the subject today, we can go have this conversation, hopefully in Brazil, with a good Brazilian caipirinha. So, Professor Tees, this is the floor for you to introduce yourself and also initial comment on the theme of the panel, please.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be with you all today, and thank you for that generous introduction. Yes, I do remember the time at Cambridge, and yes, dynamic capabilities is, I think of it as a systems approach to understanding business and society. And today we're going to not focus directly on dynamic capabilities, but indirectly on dynamic capabilities. But this time it's the dynamic capabilities of universities and the ecosystems in which they exist and how they can shape the ecosystem and how the ecosystem can shape them. So if we can put up the first slide, please. the title I've chosen today is Enhancing University Ecosystems and the role of actually the management of the university. Next slide, please. My table of contents is the first section is going to be a general background, which in the light of the limited time, I'm going to skip. And I'm going to jump straight into section 2, the role of the university in innovation ecosystems, and then look at this two-way causation, while along the way touching on the importance of dynamic capabilities in both private enterprises and also in the university. So let's go to section 2, if I may. First slide, please. So here is a broader view of the ecosystem for innovation. The ecosystem for innovation is not just a cluster of firms that are doing similar things. It's both competitors and complementers that coexist, if you will, and co-evolve. And the success of any ecosystem depends on many factors. What I've highlighted and what we're talking about today is the role of the university. But it's also very important to have the right legal framework, sufficient venture capital, sufficient skills, sufficient suppliers and complementers and so forth. And particularly in the digital world, complementers are very, very important. So let's focus on the university, but bear in mind that the ecosystem has many different players, and that somewhere in the system, you need some kind of leadership. And as we'll see with Silicon Valley, actually, Dean Terman in engineering was that kind of spark plug and catalyst for many good things. But at the same time, we don't want to overemphasize and overclaim what the university can do. Next slide, please. So my first statement is that universities are important pillars to dynamic ecosystems. And any ecosystem that's going to survive must be dynamic. I'm going to focus on the ecosystem I know the best, which is the one right here in Northern California that we call Silicon Valley. And there are 3 great institutions here that are important. Stanford gets most of the attention, but in fact, you dig deeper, you'll find UC Berkeley is a very important player, and particularly with respect to biotech, UCSF, which is also part of the University of California system, that's a medical school, is really critical. So having these 3 great institutions of higher learning and of research has been critical to the success in Northern California, and very much underappreciated today by the state. The budget, for instance, for the University of California, Berkeley, the state is providing less than 10% of it today, whereas in the early days of Silicon Valley, it was north of 80%. So the state has itself forgotten why Silicon Valley is successful and is throwing money in all kinds of things, but education and research is not, in my mind, getting its fair share. Next slide, please. So this is the Silicon Valley of today. The inner circle, for those of you that know the geography, is a little bit the old Silicon Valley. The new Silicon Valley really goes almost up into Napa Valley, goes even further than this dotted line, and goes south to Gilroy. So post 2000, it's really, Northern California, the San Francisco Bay Area is America's biggest cauldron of startups, and one could argue it's also one of the biggest cauldrons of science and technology, but it's more the startup community, which in turn relies on science and technology. So in this area, 25% of the workforce is highly skilled and highly paid, and with high levels of productivity. And there's 8 to 12 million people in this this cluster. Next slide, please. What's important, and this is where dynamic capabilities comes in, is no ecosystem will last unless it's dynamic and unless there's a constant renewal. And if you look at Silicon Valley, it did start with the transistor and the integrated circuit and all of that, but it's gone on to, embrace biotech and the internet, and now, of course, with big tech, the whole digital revolution is being driven substantially from firms in the Western United States. Sadly, Europe is really not driving it in any way whatsoever. It's the United States and, to a lesser extent, China that's driving the digital revolution. But it's this ability to renew, to move from one class of technologies to another, from integrated circuits through to the personal computer, through to the internet. And then the next wave is probably artificial intelligence, which of course will rely very importantly on the internet to be effective. Next slide, please. Well, where did it all get started? This is an important question if you're trying to think of what is that ignition point. And in this case, it wasn't the university. It was actually Bell Labs in New Jersey, where the transistor was invented. And it was also AT&T, the company that that owned Bell Labs, that decided to make this technology available to the world for a very minimal licensing fee. So there was no effort to keep it proprietary. And remember that AT&T was the phone company, was a regulated monopoly, basically, and it figured its best interest was to let 1,000 flowers bloom. And so everybody, including Sony in Japan, was one of the first to take up a license and, of course, create the Sony transistor radio way before anything, a miniature radio, before anybody else did. So this was in the time period when America was giving technology away. It was still giving technology away, although that's going to change, I think, with strategic rivalry from China. The United States can't afford to do this forever. But this was a gift to the world from Bell Labs. Next slide, please. And that led to the inventor of the transistor, Mr. Shockley, William Shockley, moved to Mountain View, California. And I believe the initial spark was not because of Stanford, not because of Berkeley. I think his mother lived in the area, and he decided to come home. And that was in 1957. Shockley was a brilliant person that attracted great talent, but he was not a good manager of talent, and much of the talent left to form Fairchild Semiconductor in 1957. Next slide, please. And so here are the two sort of key, if you really want to ask who the fathers of Silicon Valley are, it's William Shockley, the inventor of the transistor, and Sherman Fairchild, who interestingly was a moneyed person. He's the MBA, if you will, and Shockley's a brilliant scientist that I believe won the Nobel Prize. But it took the marriage of technology and finance. Fairchild was a New Yorker, I think, on Long Island with Fairchild Industries, and he took the bold step of creating Fairchild Semiconductor in California. Next slide, please. But then it went beyond that. Fairchild Robert Noyce then invented the integrated circuit along with Jack Kilby from Texas Instruments in the state of Texas. Almost a parallel simultaneous invention of the integrated circuit. And that's really, of course, what gave fuel and momentum to Silicon Valley. Next slide, please. But it was also co-located with the university. And the story I'm giving you, of course, is that Stanford wasn't there at the very beginning, but Dean Terman jumped in. And this was an age when Stanford was not what it is today, of course. It was a very underfunded private university, and it needed research funds. It needed to be relevant. And Terman stepped in and got research grants and started training up people in the new semiconductor technology. But along with Stanford, there was corporate research labs, IBM and Xerox, in the area as well. And those corporate research labs are just as important, if not more important, than Stanford University in the early days. But Stanford nevertheless played a key role and determined if it wasn't, it was the institution, but it was also the individual, a very entrepreneurial dean who saw the possibilities of the future and had enough latitude. The governance structure at Stanford was flexible enough that he could basically do what he wanted, which is true today. You know, a faculty member or a dean got a lot more freedom, I think, at Stanford than in many other places. But nevertheless, there is uncommon freedom to act in both the University of California, Berkeley, and in Stanford. And that, if you will, loose faculty governance is an important part of being able to exercise dynamic capabilities. If you have your hands tied, you can't be very entrepreneurial. So loose governance actually may sound strange to some people, but loose governance is better than tight governance when it comes to these types of questions. Next slide, please. Hewlett and Packard and Varian, they were students from Stanford and engineering students, and they were the first to move to the new Stanford Business Park. And it was Fred Terman, the dean. The university had extra land, and he persuaded the university to set up a shopping center to get additional revenues, but also to rent out some of the surplus land. Remember, Stanford University is sometimes referred to as the farm because they had, I forget how many acres, 10,000 acres or something like that, which was mainly, you know, orchards and agriculture, and to take a piece of that and make an industrial park. But just making an industrial park doesn't make an ecosystem blossom. It's all of these pieces working together. Next slide, please. Let's look at both the cause and effect, the role of the university in igniting or at least in fueling ecosystems, and also the role of ecosystems in supporting universities. Next slide, please. Well, here's a quote from Gordon Moore. Now, Gordon Moore was a founder of Intel. He was part of this early Shockley thing. This doesn't get much prominence. This is actually in a book that William Spencer edited. Spencer himself was a former head of Xerox PARC. But Gordon Moore was quite explicit. We do not hold Stanford to have been essential to the formation of Silicon Valley. Well, he was a Berkeley grad, and that's not the reason why he's saying that. I think he's pointing out that the key thing was Fairchild, Sherman Fairchild, and bringing finance early into the equation. So Fairchild was sort of not a VC as such, but he acted in the role of a VC, a venture capitalist. Next slide, please. Stanford or the universities had an important role, though. There was military research that was being conducted. There was active recruitment of firms. There was early financial support. And importantly, there was training of graduates with relevant experience. This is probably where Terman excelled. He set up new programs in the new semiconductor sciences and technology. And the graduates that were churned out were very smart and were very relevant to what was needed in industry. And that, I think, is part of the secret. Next slide, please. And that's what's continued to fuel what I referred to earlier as these ongoing waves of innovation. The curriculum at both Berkeley and Stanford changes to reflect these new developments, and it changes very rapidly. And today, of course, we often have lecturers and faculty from the outside that come in and teach some of this, and get the faculty motivated to focus on the right thing with small research grants and things of that kind. Next slide, please. And then that, of course, leads eventually to a whole bunch of product innovation, not just microprocessors and integrated circuits, but disk storage and social networking. And it's all about productization, and that's where you need capital. I mean, research and development, as expensive as it is cheap relative to the cost of entering markets. That's not true with a pure software product, but with just about anything else. And back in those days, of course, there was a lot of hardware and manufacturing involved. In fact, Silicon Valley initially had semiconductor fabs here. And of course, there are none here anymore, but early on, it was very important. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there are certain organizational imperatives. You've got to have a merit-based system. You can't have cronyism. You can't just be appointing your friends. Yes, if they're professional friends and can contribute, yes, but you can't have sons and daughters that are untrained in the companies. You've really got to have people that can produce to create a culture that's very merit-oriented and very results-driven. And very loose hierarchically. In fact, the invention that went along with Silicon Valley was a flat organizational structure. Guys like Gordon Moore also took over leadership. So you had actually the engineers leading these companies, whereas up till then, it had been the finance guys that would end up in the office of the CEO. But the basic structure of who was running a company changed. We forget this now because we see guys like Elon Musk, who's very much an inventor himself, running a company. But back then, that was unusual. It was administrative people trained in management that ran these companies. Now it's not enough just to be a good manager. And if you have to choose, being strong at technology and being smart enough to learn the management should be a priority. It's easier for a strong scientist and tech engineer to learn how to manage than it is for a manager to learn engineering. Next slide, please. So what are some of the enablers of this dynamic regional ecosystem? This sort of entrepreneurial ability to change, which is really basically dynamic capabilities. And dynamic capabilities wasn't invented by David Teese. Dynamic capabilities was invented by companies in Silicon Valley. All I am is a mouthpiece to explain in the language of today's social science what it is that drives these companies. And not only do they have this entrepreneurial ability to pivot, even at large scale, but also to shape their environment, to learn from mistakes, to fail graciously, but importantly, to dream big. And if you're, quote, just a manager, you're typically not dreaming big. You're focused on operations, you're focused on small improvements. But to have strong dynamic capabilities, you need to dream big and have an educated workforce and easy access to the universities. So that's the kind of the secret sauce that makes an ecosystem not just get started, but stay alive. Next slide, please. Now, behind it all is the role of the state. Mariana Muscato at the University of London has rightfully reminded people of this, but it's well known. Richard Nelson, other great scholars, been making these points for a long, long time. It's important to have flexible labor laws. It's important to be easy to have government policy that allows quick startups. It requires free flow of information, and importantly, strong universities. If you don't have strong universities, and by strong, it's not necessarily just the high-end research, but have really smart, capable faculty who are willing to work on things that are both basic science and relevance, to keep one foot in both worlds. Without being corrupted by either. Next slide, please. Now, am I saying anything new? Well, yes, if you go and read Gerschenkron, who is one of the world's leading economic historians, his story of economic development is that it required large capital. If you're a late developer, it required large amounts of capital from governments. And he didn't emphasize the role of venture capital. It was barely existing in 1962. There was Venrock, the Rockefeller family in New York, and I think it was William Rockefeller who was running that was involved early on. But today in the United States and in Europe, and I think in Latin America too, there's a venture capital industry, and it's a different type of capital than is provided by banks. You know, banks are still important for scaling, but venture capital is really risk capital that works in tandem. It's not just money, it's money tied in with advice and governance and assistance. Venture capital is much more than capital, and that's important to understand. But it's not big banks that drive this kind of ecosystem development. It's smaller banks. The Silicon Valley Bank, quite a big bank now, I suppose, but it's small, nimble, flexible banks that you need to be alongside these new startup companies. Next slide, please. All right, so let's see if we can summarize a little bit the role of the university. Not necessarily deterministic. You know, if you got the university in the wrong place, think of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, a great university, but there's not much in the way of a supportive infrastructure around that. And it's really not ignited very much of an ecosystem, and nor has Cornell. Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh has, though, particularly in AI. Carnegie Mellon's important, although it tends to get rated by Google anytime it gets anything going. By rated, I mean there's a talent rate. So not as much has happened around Pittsburgh area as might otherwise have happened, but clearly Pittsburgh has completely transformed from Steel City to AI City. And then there's other environmental factors, and in particular, I stress entrepreneurship, and behind that is dynamic capabilities. Once these companies get to be of any size, if you're not constantly re-engineering, pivoting, and transforming, you're not going to be relevant. And, you know, big companies like Intel have sort of slowed down, and you wonder whether they've got the dynamic capabilities they once had. Next slide, please. It also turns out that certain areas are attractive for graduating talent. And this shows that, you know, like while the East Coast universities in the United States, a lot of their graduates come to the West Coast, to Silicon Valley, just about everybody who graduates from Stanford or Berkeley in engineering or business, they don't go anywhere. They stay here. They don't go hunting in New York for jobs. There's plenty of relevant jobs here, and they come to business school and they come to engineering school here on the West Coast, in part because Silicon Valley's here. So Silicon Valley helps attract great students. You get a vigorous ecosystem. It also brings in the world's top talent. Next slide, please. It's also important to have good strategy through smart organizational design. You know, the Nobel laureate Herbert Simon recognized these things and recognized that you can't exist, whether it's in the university or in business, you can't exist in silos. You have to constantly be mixing up talent. And R&D departments, as he points out, is like mixing oil with water. It's easy to describe the intended product, less easy to produce it. So there's this constant need for interdisciplinary activity and for looking at problems first, not looking at the science and figuring out how to apply it, but looking at the problems and figuring out what science is necessary and how to be ambidextrous, how to be dynamically capable, how to coordinate, orchestrate, all of these issues around not just agility, but around strategy and also shaping the environment you're in. You're not a passive player. You can shape the environment. And that's the partnerships and the joint ventures that you have as well. So as most ecosystems co-evolve. In fact, all ecosystems co-evolve. So you've got to bring along your complementers and hopefully leave your competitors behind. Next slide, please. And here's a little bit of indication of this governance point that I pointed out earlier, that, you know, Stanford and MIT have a lot of freedom. You know, actually at the faculty level, Berkeley does too. At the dean level, we don't. But I've got other work, if anyone's interested, that I'm doing with Sophie Heaton, where we can actually show that universities that have looser governance do better than those with tighter governance. And when I say do better, I mean they do better financially. And of course, financial viability of a university is important to its long-term success. Next slide, please. And we're almost at the end. I don't want to take too much of other people's time. many universities have something called a technology transfer office. And a lot of people, particularly academics, think that that's what the critical link is to the ecosystem. And generally it's not. And it's not because university technology transfer offices are typically inside the university and are run by people who are, you know, a little bit bureaucratic because they have to be given the rules of the university. So I don't think the technology transfer office is the key thing to look at when you're trying to understand the connections between a university and industry. It does help with licensing, but because the administrators and executives in the transfer office are not entrepreneurial, they really don't do the things that Fred Terman did at Stanford. Next slide, please. Here are my conclusions. There are many elements to a successful regional ecosystem, but the university can be a key anchor and leader. Not only does the university help the ecosystem, but the ecosystem can provide resources back to the university to strengthen the university's research and to strengthen its attractiveness for faculty and skills. So think ecosystems, think of codependence, think of co-evolution, and think of dynamic capabilities. I'll leave it at that and hope we can have a discussion about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor David T.C. Paulo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. David, it was a pleasure to hear you. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. When David sent me his paper and I obviously take a look at that, I was thinking on something that I may add to the discussion. And since we have a very good data bank on Brazilian companies, we decided to look a little bit inside this data bank and try to understand a little bit better how do companies behave in terms of interaction. We don't have such a elegant ecosystem as Silicon Valley, but as a matter of fact, we are trying to understand a little bit what. So I have prepared some notes here. Not only well, indirectly thinking about universities, but especially looking to companies, because the ecosystem need companies to work, and this is perhaps the first thing I would like to state here. Well, I will share my screen to you. Just hope it works. Okay, so that's a little bit what we are. You are all seeing the screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay.
Very good.
So this is something we are asking. If well, in one side we have universities boosting ecosystems, for example. We would like to know is there an ecosystemic innovation capability? What kind of innovation capability companies are ought to arrange, to organize, to in fact be in successful relation with ecosystems. This is a little bit what we have been asking, and of course I took some quotes of David in his presentation. Universities are important pillars to dynamic ecosystems. You started with that quote, and in the middle of your presentation, you highlight that they are not per se enough to guarantee the emergence of successful ecosystems, and this is something we want to share. To talk about innovation ecosystems, you have to talk about companies. And what are companies? In fact, companies is a bunch of knowledge, a bunch of capabilities. They are limited, both knowledge and capabilities. They are not enough in themselves to accomplish, especially innovation endeavor and goals. So companies, in fact, they need to find sources of knowledge and technology elsewhere. And the ecosystem works especially perfectly or fitable to this goal. So what we are asking here, if the company is that bunch of bounded innovation capabilities, which is the best capability arrangement to interact with an ecosystem? Of course, we try to understand what is the evolution of ecosystem. I took a little bit the ideas of David and Hitter and Siegel, this paper, and the idea of an evolutionary stage-based analysis, and we are somehow imagine something like that. Just imagine on the left side an individual company doing its R&D alone, and try to imagine the upgrading of relations a company can do, starting, of course, with university and industry interactions. So what we are trying to understand is, from this point here, what kind of arrangement of innovation capabilities the company must have to interact. Of course, we have to understand a little bit what innovation capabilities are. I will not stress this slide, but for us, what we are trying to sum a little bit what have been told about innovation capabilities in the last 30 to 40 years is that innovation capabilities are technology and business for the organization of the firm. So this is a little bit the idea of having this way of seeing innovation capabilities, and these elements to the development capability, operations, management, and transaction capabilities, with that idea of having a technology such as Lau, Bell, and Pavit's look, or a business oriented such as dynamic capabilities are trying to understand. We try to a little bit have this kind of arrangement. So you got a technological drive, product and process, a business drive, transactions and management. You have that firm side of the company, if you want, is the economic agent side, that it's the product and the market, and you have this internal organizational side, that operations and management. With this in mind, and having our data bank on 1,300 Brazilian manufacturing companies, we just have this fresh. So this is the very first time we are showing this data. What we have asked the companies, among a lot of things, is if they interact or not with universities. And the first information is that from this sample, only 90% of companies interact with university. So this is a very first information, and it's very interesting because it gives us two contrasting clusters, from interacting companies to non-interacting companies. And then we went look for their innovation capabilities, the sources of technology of each cluster, and how they get the classical ESG topics, and then performance. This is some data. I won't stress you. I'm almost finishing to the conclusions and the ideas we have here on that matter. But if you want interacting companies to have positive performance, must rely on transaction capability and development capabilities, while non-interacting companies with positive performance rely on management and transaction capability. So if you want, look into this in that figure, that picture from innovation capabilities. If you want, interacting companies normally rely on development and operations, on technology to get, while non-interacting companies rely on the organizational side to get. So the green are interacting companies, while reds are non-interacting companies, and they do have to rely on development and transactions. If we take a look, to the sources of technology, the ESG and performance, what we have, it's obviously that contrasting innovative behavior. Interacting companies are ecosystem oriented. if we take a look to the sources, they look towards university clients and the external market. While non-interacting companies are much more supplier dominated, such as habits remind us on the organization of companies. Interacting companies are much more social environment responsible. It's very interesting. It's really I won't show you data because we don't have enough time. But the best interacting companies have better performance than non-interacting companies, and this is perhaps the most important thing. So what we are asking, is there an economic innovation capability? I think by this data to surf in this university interaction, university industry interactions, to classical triple helix or quadruple helix models, what we are trying to define here as an ecosystemic innovation capability should be something like to focus on development and transaction capabilities for social environment ecosystemic relations with university clients and external markets. In conclusion, not only better performance of interacting, and this idea of development and transaction capabilities that perhaps help us to understand why startups depend so much on ecosystems, because they are product and market oriented in the very beginning of the year. So they need the ecosystem. This is something, David, perhaps we would like to add in our discussion. Universities and others, institutional stakeholders from an ecosystem, innovation ecosystem, must be somehow development and transaction ready. In Brazil, we are lacking of this readiness on our universities, for example. We don't know how to develop in cooperation with companies and how to transact. And finally, I think that national and local governments must think about a policy for building ecosystemic innovation capabilities on companies. So you cannot have an innovation ecosystem only based on university. You must also rely on companies. Thank you very much. And well, let's hear some ideas.
Wow, what a summary! It's not just some ideas, and I think you devise very stimulating and challenge ideas, and the Professor David Tiss as well. I'm worrying already about the time because you have so many insightful concepts, and here I'll be quite short in my initial provocation questions for both of you, and then we open for the audience to send the questions by the bate-papo. I don't remember the word in English, sorry. The chat. Okay, two questions to listen from you. We have a very heterogeneous audience. I'm seeing here professors, senior professors, PhD students, master and MBA students, and so on. So I try to fit both all the kinds of audience. One question I was preparing here, listening for your presentations about the level of the dynamic capability. And Paulo presented the idea of ecosystemic innovation capability. And but still, I think that even when Paulo put that, it's still talking about the Fermi level. My first question is, may we talk about ecosystem level of dynamic capabilities? This is the first question. The second question is connected with the first, is what about the main differences of the concept of clusters, technological clusters, and the concept of innovation ecosystems? So, Fermi level versus ecosystem level of dynamic capabilities, and clusters versus ecosystem innovation ecosystem. So, Professor Tiss, please.
Yes, very, very good questions. The first one was about ecosystem level dynamic capabilities. Well, yes. So you need not only the firms, which Paulo emphasized, to have dynamic capabilities, not only the universities, which I indicated, particularly in the engineering schools, it's important, but also governments and local governments in particular. This is what Mariana Muscatato at the University of London has been writing about, is the importance for governments to have dynamic capabilities. And it's not to direct, but to guide. I mean, in all of these environments, you need sort of an ecosystem, or you need ecosystem captains, but they're not really administrators. They're not, they're not people that lay down the law, but they help facilitate and guide, because everything here is cooperative. This cooperation and competition takes place inside ecosystems. So it requires, cooperation, loose amalgamations, as Paulo pointed out, alliances of one kind or another. And this is, kind of, we don't always teach this very well in business schools. We tend to teach administrators to administer inside organizations, but in fact, you've got to coordinate between organizations, and that with an ecosystem, it's the interaction between the entities and the different levels of government and venture capital that are important. There's a very different view. It's a non-hierarchical view, but it's not a chaotic view. It's one that requires guidance and a shared mission.
Paulo, the floor is yours.
Sorry about that. Two things. I think I will start for this from the second question about the difference on clusters and ecosystems. I think clusters are much more, as an economist, I cannot escape the idea of the Marshallian district, where you found companies all together having these economies of location. The ecosystems is a little bit more it's
more general,
less focus on the space and much more focus on the relations, something like that. And I think the idea of an ecosystem relies much more, and we are able to speak in terms of an ecosystem because of the digital revolution. So when you speak of an ecosystem, you need a kind of relation that is not only physical relation, and this is the basis of the relations in terms of knowledge development. And I think an ecosystem, it's much more development oriented than operations or production or logistics oriented as a cluster. This is a first thing. And then I think in terms of that differences, companies are to be different too, because when we ask to our Brazilian companies if they interact or not with universities, we are not asking, we can do that because we have their addresses and we know where they are physically. So we can even more try to locate them in terms of a spatial and region. But when we ask if they interact or not, we are asking if they are relying on knowledge that they don't have. It's different when you ask if you are attached to a company in terms of physical relations or more than technological interfaces, but physical interfaces to accomplish a process, to establish a supply chain or something like that. But this is something very interesting because I think firms, ecosystems, better firms, universities, and government must understand the role of dynamic capabilities much more for development, of course, in an ecosystem than in a simple cluster. This is perhaps why we find so many clusters in Brazil and less ecosystems that we would like to find.
Yeah, I'm very, very sad, but the time is almost over. I will read briefly some questions that were put in our chat, and I will give you the word back, and then both of you please make a mix of final comments and try to touch the questions, okay?
Professor Moacir, I have received the information that we could stretch for 10 more minutes. So until 2 p.m., we could stretch the time.
Oh,
so we want 10 more minutes, okay?
For those who believe in God, oh my God. So thank you very much, Isa. Very, very good. So, better. Let's do that. The first question is by Andrei Mikhailov, and he's asking Paulo. I read the questions. I open and then close the question. So I read that, and you answer according to your convenience. Because we have 10 minutes, the more 5 minutes for Paulo, 5 for David, and that's all. Paulo, there is a question about from Andrei Mikhailov. He's asking you about what kind of interaction you discovered in your research among university and industry. What kind of interaction? There is another question by Patricia Prado. Patricia is asking both of you about the path dependency concept. She missed that. I did not miss, I'm sorry, because Professor Pisi make a historical presentation from the beginning. But okay, this is a question. There is another colleague there. Let me see the name of the author of the question. Letizia Donati. Letizia is asking about what universities located in fragile innovation ecosystems can do to escalate for this kind of concept we presented today. And then we have a discussion why Silicon Valley is so successful, but for example, Boston University is not the same, having amazing universities like MIT and Harvard. And that's all. The follow-up is yours, Paul, and then Professor Thies, and then we close our amazing session.
Okay. Well, first, it was Andrei's question. Yes, we may try to in-depth that information, but we did not use it on that analysis. We have the type of interaction, but we did not use it at this moment. Only what we would like to know is if they are interacting or not. Normally, we have different levels of interaction. We have already done something in terms of that to understand a little bit, and there's something you can ask me then. You have my email, and you can ask them. I can give you the paper. But there is one last thing I would like to say. I think the idea of an ecosystem, as I told, of course, there is the geographical asset of being in such a region or not. But I think more than simple geographically, you have to rely on the different kind of relations you establish, and perhaps I see here there is a question about why do Brazilian universities seems to be so far away from the example of American universities. I think, as a matter of fact, the idea of path dependency and the history of the place, try to gather a little bit thing, can impact on the pace, on the evolutionary stage that you have to go through to establish a real ecosystem. That's why I told you we are still, in my opinion, far away to have real ecosystems as we are reading elsewhere or watching great presentations such as David's about Silicon Valley and all the years that we can map and try to better understand why Silicon Valley, for example, is a successful case of an ecosystem. But if we are aware of the details and the features that we need to establish a good ecosystem, a successful ecosystem, perhaps we could help local and national government to build policies and programs and projects that are focused on that building process of ecosystems. I think we are missing a little bit this part. So once again, thank you very much, Moacir, for that opportunity.
Okay, just a few comments on these excellent points. First of all, it's great to think about the distinction between an ecosystem and a cluster. And I think a strong ecosystem like Silicon Valley has multiple clusters. You've got a biotech cluster, you got an electronic cluster, you got an internet cluster. And of course, digital is sort of pulling all these things together. They're not like isolated clusters, they're clusters that feed on each other. So electronics has helped biotech and vice versa. So there's a buoyant ecosystem is likely to have multiple clusters, and clusters are defined more by particular technologies and product focus. But it is an interesting distinction, and maybe an ecosystem begins around a cluster and then adds multiple clusters. Another question was put forward around the whole question of path dependencies, and clearly there is some amount of path dependency, but one shouldn't assume that it's inexorable, that once it gets started, it goes on forever and there's no way it can be shaped. Institutions, individuals shape the course through strategy. And it's not completely lockstep in my view. I know many of my economist friends like to think of, increasing returns inexorably marching forward. Whoever gets ahead stays ahead forever. Only if they got strong dynamic capabilities will they stay ahead forever. If they're weak on dynamic capabilities, they'll lose out. And it's possibly complementers that overnight morph into being competitors. So in ecosystems, there's no longer a complementer is a complementer forever. The complementer almost overnight can sometimes turn out to be a competitor. I'll just leave it at that, other than leave us with the thought of, with COVID, and remote working, what is this doing to the geography of ecosystems? And I think there's still going to be what we refer to metaphorically as the conversations around the water cooler, the casual conversations that are unstructured, that are very important for a dynamic ecosystem and for information and knowledge sharing. So you'll notice that companies in the United States are asking the people to come back to work, although it will not be, 5 days a week and maybe 4 days a week in the office. But when you're in the office, you're certainly going to be interacting, being isolated in the office. If you're going to be isolated, well, you might as well be isolated at home. But I think there's going to be a greater emphasis on the time in the office being more productive in terms of interaction and creativity. So I'll just leave it at that. And thank you all for the opportunity to meet with you and speak today. My slides are available, and there's enough references to the literature. And indeed, Alfred Marshall, Paulo, is in the first part of my slide deck. I continue to take inspiration from him.
Thank you very, very much, Professor David Disse, Professor Paulo Zavzlak. We have 2 minutes to finish our presentation, our panel. We have data to share with you. We have around 150 people seeing us in different platforms at the website, the conference website, the Zoom and YouTube, and people from 22 countries. Very diverse geographies, different continents, and so on. I want to thank you both very much, both of you, for this amazing panel. I want to make a special thank you to Professor Paulo Zavzlak. Paulo is the head of NITEC, is one of the pioneers research centers on innovation management in the country. His work is very influential in Brazil and Latin America and the world. And the center under his coordination have the honor of the 30 years old anniversary recently. So congratulations to Paulo for his pioneer
Thank you very much.
initiative. And Professor David Tisci, Professor, I do apologize for what I said just in the beginning, but it's the words of a fan of your work. I've been following your work since the past century. So it's a long time ago, and it's quite interesting to see you put all the strategy approach together with all this innovation approach. What is about it in a much more simple way? What I've done. I'm a strategy professor there. I'm doing research and innovation for the last 15 years. Not like Professor Paul, that he is a pioneer in the field of innovation management. I joined the field just 15 years ago. So thank you, both of you. It was an amazing panel, very impactful. I think this is the kind of panel that sometimes change the mind, it change the life, it change the direction of research. And I thank you very much, and give the word back to Isa. The turn is yours. It's your turn. The floor is yours.
Okay. On behalf of Triple Helix, I thank you, Professor Dr. David, Professor Paulo, and Moacir. Now, we're going to continue with our panel sessions from 2 p.m. to 3 p.m. Brazilian time. And at 3:10, we'll have the next dialogue session. So, till there. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you,
obrigado,
Moacir.
viu, Paulo? Bom demais, viu? Obrigado mesmo por organizar esse painel fantástico. Não, foi fantástico. As mensagens que eu estou recebendo aqui do Brasil, do mundo, eu vou te passar isso aí, viu, cara?
Por favor,
22 países, viu? 22 países online.
Que bom.